A sacred Native American worship site is now at the center of a growing legal battle. Preservation, spiritual heritage, and modern development are colliding head-on. What happens when ancient tradition meets today's legal system? Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists that we have with us for today. First, we have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have with us Dr. Nia Johnson, who's Assistant Professor at Wake Forest Law School. We also have with us Dr. Andrew Polk, Professor of History at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of American Religion. And lastly, we have Reverend Dr. Galen Carey, who's the Vice President of Government Relations for the National Association of Evangelicals. Ladies and gentlemen, great having you here and looking forward to our show today. You know, there's been an interesting conversation regarding Native American worship sites that's been going around for a long time. There's a phrase called arbitrary government interference. That's what the Knights of Columbus warned will befall religious believers in the U.S. if a copper mining company is allowed to take possession of and destroy a centuries-old Native American worship site in Arizona. That site is called Oak Flat. It has been a subject of years of dispute and litigation, with a coalition group of activists known as Apache Stronghold leading an effort to prevent the government from surrendering the ancient religious location for private interests. For decades, the federal government protected the parcel from development in the Tonto National Forest, but during the Obama administration several years ago, they began the process of transferring the land to the multinational Resolution Copper, whose mining operations will dig massive pits at the site and at the end of its status as a center of worship. You know, Melissa, we've been talking about Apache Stronghold for almost 10 years, and it seems as though the matter never gets fully resolved. On one hand, it seems as though we're not going to dig. Then we got a new administration, we are going to dig. But for some reason, the overall concept of it being a worship site doesn't seem to be sticking. You know, what's going on with this issue, and how can we get some better traction in understanding what's happening here?
Well, you know, Orlin, we talk about competing interest a lot of the times here on this program, and this is certainly the case here. We have $200 billion worth of copper on a spiritual landmark or a sacred site. And those are very compelled perspectives. And so, as you said, this has been going on for over a decade. It's interesting, you know, a new member of Congress who waited quite a while to be seated was Representative Grijalva, and her father, back in 2015, introduced the Save Oak Flat from Foreign Mining Act. And her first act as a sitting representative was to reintroduce that piece of legislation because that fight is still going on at the same time. So we're seeing the fight taking place legislatively again. We're expecting at the beginning of 2026 for a federal appeals court to review 3 different lawsuits, a combination of those. This in 2025, the Supreme Court declined to take this matter up, but it's a big deal to a lot of people. Yeah. I really like and am proud to see the broader religious community rallying around the rights and the freedoms of the Apache people. And that, I think, has helped draw attention to it and the rights that are involved. But $200 billion is a lot of money, and it's motivational to the people who own the land and want to make use of it in that way, want to make some money.
Yeah, this is one of those cases and issues that is really complicated and doesn't fit neatly in the kind of dichotomy we like to have, right? So this, as you said, is introduced in 2014 during President Obama's administration by Senator John McCain, right? That when the Supreme Court declined this time to hear it, I think for the second time, right? This wasn't clearly divided among conservative and liberal justices. So the legal aspect, because this was originally introduced by Senator McCain, I believe in a military appropriations bill. The legal aspects are pretty straightforward here. The issue is the policy aspect, right? So what was the purpose of this? Is there protection of land? There's some environmental issues, but the real core of it is how much does the fact that the Apache people consider this a sacred site matter in this negotiation? It's a land swap. The federal government gained 3,000 acres of land through this swap. It's a British-Australian conglomerate that's going to mine them. There's a lot of issues that's involved here. And as much as we like to have these clear-cut and conservative and liberal perspectives, this one doesn't really fall into it. So I think this is going to get more complicated as it goes on.
Yeah, and I was also just going to add on to this point of one, it not being something that is so clearly cut, which is actually refreshing, I think, nowadays. But I also think that it's a really nice kind of warning signal. Like we're in a moment right now where a lot of religious institutions are seeing it as a time to take the green light to invest themselves in political issues, to engage in partisanship, amongst other things, and also to take large sums of money, right, from organizations that have political ties, partisan ties to actually move forward some of their agendas. And this is a really great example of what can happen when you're working with that much money. Like, at some point it corrupts principles that we already kind of understand to be quite clear, right? Like we talk about a fair amount on this show, the privileging of Christianity. And how Christian insiders don't necessarily view other religions as being as legitimate as their own. And this is actually, an area of law that has been protected by bipartisanship in many different ways. But I think this is a very interesting cautionary tale. Of course, not, on the backs of the indigenous folks who this is a sacred site for them, but more so in the broader context of how money can disrupt political goals and also can disrupt religious goals as well.
In addition to the legal issues, and clearly religious freedom, if it means anything, it has to be for everybody, including those that are have small numbers of adherents. Otherwise, it's something else. It's not religious freedom. But in addition to that, I think in light of our history with the Native American people, there should be a special solicitude that we have for concerns of their community. In light of everything that's been done to them, we should at least be taking care to do what we can to protect what's left of the land that they once occupied.
I guess the struggle is, Andrew, there's a saying, no money, no mission. And when you start dealing with $200 billion on one side of the table and what someone would call a sacred ground on the other side of the table, the world I live in, usually sacred ground you can find a price, right? And I think that's the struggle here, that sometimes when someone's religious beliefs are that intense, there is no dollar figure that makes a difference. And that seems to be part of the struggle we're having here.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that money is a major factor here. This is maybe the U.S.'s largest copper reserve, untapped copper reserve that we have. I think there's also an issue, as the other panelists have noted, that the fact that this is quote unquote sacred land, oftentimes predominantly Christian groups don't understand or value that, right? So you can have a sacred place, right? Usually a building, sacred activities, rituals.
Good point.
But the idea that, well, this is sacred land, the response from the companies is, well, we'll replant these oak trees somewhere else. Isn't that the sacred thing that you have? And the argument, no, the place itself is sacred. It's difficult to reconcile that with an understanding of the sacred that is very rarely tied to land in the larger Christian, really Abrahamic traditions. And usually that therefore becomes immediately devalued, right? The lack of understanding also becomes a means to say, yeah, but that's not real. That's not a thing that's there. It's an excuse to keep this land. When very clearly from the Apache people, that's not true. This is not a workaround. This has been going on for longer than that 2014 period It was just quote unquote settled by the issue of that appropriations bill.
Yeah, and I also want to add on to that, there's also another religion that's actually quite privileged in the US, which is the religion of money, right? Like, again, like there's a lot of money, at stake here. And it's also being outlined in a way that doesn't necessarily tie with the values of indigenous populations either, right? The commitment to the land and how it is treated and the importance of space. This is a very, very different worldview. And this is also why it's so important that, again, when we're having interfaith conversations, that we're being inclusive of all types of religious groups, right? And all folks of faith. So that way that we can make sure that we are being advocates and supporting folks who have a different connection with the land. There are growing groups, whether that's from, Baptist groups, Catholic groups, Seventh-day Adventist groups, evangelical populations who have been, for example, very invested in conversations around conservation, right? We would be remiss to not include, Native American individuals in that discourse, because they are kind of like, the parents of that conversation. And so it's important that we keep that in mind.
I was just going to tag on to what Nia was saying as far as the conservation component. And just, again, from my, Western Christian sort of perspective, I don't have that same tie to sort of land that we're seeing here. That doesn't mean that I can't be sympathetic to those and honor those who do have that tie. But I'm just imagining, for those who have this spiritual connection to this physical place, this physical land, imagine what it does to your soul for a giant crater 2 miles wide to desecrate it. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? That's tragic. That's heartbreaking from their perspective. So again, I'm hoping that either with the legislative efforts or with the federal judicial efforts, that there will be some resolution that takes place. The land swap thing, those haven't worked out well in the past for Native Americans. And again, it's not a fix here for a place that the spirituality of it is specific to the land.
Galen, I got to ask you, does this sometimes beg more of a responsibility for other religious groups to really be out pushing the agenda to support this, in an effort to make sure that we are also telling the world that, we want our religious beliefs to be protected, but it's not just for us, but it's for others, because most people would look at maybe Native Americans and not really, quote unquote, understand their religious beliefs per se and the sacredness of ground, that maybe other religious groups have the responsibility to do something about it.
Well, of course, Jesus taught what we refer to as the golden rule, and how we want others to treat us should guide the way that we treat them. And I think it's really a test of how serious is our commitment to religious freedom. If it's going to cost something, are we still behind it, or do we have a price as well? And at a certain point, we're willing to set that aside.
I have to let that be the last word, Galen, but I think the real point you're making, which is a critical focus here, the willingness to be willing to sacrifice something in the name of what you believe from a religious standpoint may be the true test to determine, are we willing to look out for our brother and be our brother's keeper as well? Coming up in our next segment, New Jersey tries to force a pro-life Christian ministry to disclose specifics on how it runs its ministry. Stick around and we'll see you in a minute. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith and Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's a recent case called First Choice Women's Resource Centers versus Platkin. First Choice Women's Resource Centers is a pro-life Christian ministry in New Jersey that offers free counseling, medical services, and material support to women facing unplanned pregnancies. A couple of years ago, New Jersey tried to force First Choice to disclose how it applies its statement of faith, works with churches to support its ministry, and relates other pro-life organizations and raises funds to support its ministry. First Choice is now at the Supreme Court. defending its ability to continue its religious ministry without government interference. You know, Nan, when you take a look at what's going on in many of these healthcare issues, and as someone who's actually done a lot of work in the healthcare industry, the real question is when do we go too far in terms of trying to protect individuals from a health perspective, but now engaging in the midst of their privacy in a way where you really want to stiff arm the government away from that? And it seems like we've got an imbalance taking place in this particular case. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think there's a number of things that are worth considering here. And ironically, they'll be a little bit more policy oriented than legal. But I think one thing to kind of keep in mind is that, you know, religious organizations have been very adept at kind of hiding the ball themselves, right? In their goals of what they have these organizations doing, right? You know, when we talk about some of these pregnancy centers that say they're providing like certain level of counseling, it is not necessarily a neutral form of counseling that would be akin to what you may find in like a hospital, for example, right? So you're not necessarily being presented both sets of issues. You're actually being presented like one particular lens, which if we think about the goal of most religious institutions, that is what religious institutions do, right? You privilege one lens to make sure that people stay within your religious viewpoint. The problem is that when that translates into a healthcare context, there are many people who believe that that is not giving people a full perspective of what their options are. And so now we're at the intersection of conviction and practicality, right? And that can be very, very challenging. The other thing to keep in mind is that we're also in a very hostile in religious environment, and not hostile and religious in that the religious folks are the ones bearing the costs of the hostility, but really we have, you know, an administration that has been very comfortable with very aggressive tactics legally and otherwise. And so there are some progressive policymakers, lawmakers who feel like, well, let's fight fire with fire, right? So if, you know, pro-life organizations are going to be protesting outside of Planned Parenthood, for example, and they have a cosign from conservative governments, then we should fight fire with fire too and make you disclose what you were doing in these facilities. Now, I do think the best way to probably handle some of these things is actually just to err on the side of transparency, which is not something that religious institutions do quite often. You know, part of this is our own blind sites or blind spots, rather. We think that we're being very forthcoming about what the goals of our organizations are, whether they're supporting social desires or not, or social needs or not, but we're not actually being that transparent, right? So if you are a pro-life institution, it should be very clear that you are telling people, if you come here, you know, and this is just in my, you know, scholarly opinion, if you come here, we are generally advocating for you to keep your child and or give them up for adoption, right? Like that level of transparency and clarity, because what we are seeing with the aggression in New Jersey and in other states when we've talked about these issues is that there are other constituents who feel like the ball has been hidden from them and there's a level of coercion that's happening that is not fair.
My understanding from this particular case is not so much transparency as far as what's happening at the center, but who's donating to the center, right? And so you have individual privacy issues as well, as far as if I'm a donor to something, you know, the state attorney general, why should they be allowed that information? And then the second thing I'm seeing is that this is actually a situation of venue, right? New Jersey is trying to keep it as a state issue, and the plaintiffs are obviously arguing in the Supreme Court for reasons that, because this is set a law federally, right? As far as the Supreme Court in 2021 in Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta said the attorney general there could not do this exact thing that New Jersey attorney general is trying to do. So I completely agree with Nia's point as far as transparency, as far as what organizations are doing. I think that that's good for those that are visiting the place, those that are donating to the organization as well. But to me, this is a bridge way too far to say that we need access to your donors.
You know, Galen, this privacy information and transparency information seems to be constantly in conflict. You know, on one hand, people should be allowed to live their lives the way they want to see fit. But if I don't get enough information, I can't ensure that you're being taken care of in a proper fashion as well. It seems like it's a little bit of a headbutting that's going on with maybe trying to do the right thing and also trying not to be too involved personally in people's lives.
Well, I agree with Melissa that the issues here aren't really about abortion. This isn't really an abortion case. That's sort of the subject matter, but as Justice Sotomayor said once, by the time your case gets to the Supreme Court, it's not about the plaintiffs. It's about some legal issue. And in this case, it really is. And it's not about privacy, really, either. It's about, as Melissa said, venue. That's one of the important issues here, because we have seen throughout our history that many times state courts have been not overly receptive to constitutional protections, especially First Amendment issues. Mm-hmm. So in this case, it was very important to the First Women's Center to have the right to take their case into the federal court. And if they weren't allowed that right in the beginning, it probably would have been, they would have been blocked from them even down the road. So in this case, you have a very hostile attorney general in the aftermath of the Roe v. Wade overturning. So this attorney general is basically harassing the center and asking for all kinds of intrusive information. And in the oral arguments, Justice Thomas asked a couple times, well, how many complaints have you received about this center? And he says none. And later he asks, how many complaints have you received? And it's none. So why is he going after them and asking for all this information to be used potentially to chill the speech of the donors, who may not want to be called out in an environment where perhaps there is hostility to a pro-life cause? So I think that's what's really critical here, is that the center, whatever the activities they're doing, that they be protected from that kind of government interference.
The two major interesting aspects of this. One part of this is, we're concerned about the type of counseling you're giving, right? If you're registered with the state, if you're giving healthcare and mental health care, I think that can be in the purview of the government. This clearly goes way beyond, with no explanation, right? Other than give us all your stuff.
Right.
The legal question that I think is going to be interesting in this as well is, does the subpoena itself constitute harm when it hasn't been enforced in any way, right? Nothing's been done with it. Give us this information. Does the request from the information, with the assumption that that information will not stay privileged, right? The Attorney General is going to release this in some way. Is that enough harm when the harm hasn't specifically been done? It's just, I would say, a reasonable expectation of harm. Legally, I'm not sure how what that's going to come out to. But I think it's an important question, because I suspect we're going to see that more and more, particularly in the next 2 or 3 years.
And I also just want to tap in here. And, when we're talking about, what is going too far, I don't want to imply that the actual request has not gone too far. We need to also be mindful of the structural context in which people are doing this, right? This is also a very important vein of the issue, right? Even, when, denominations talk about evangelism, right? This idea of we're going to invite you somewhere to eat, and then you're going to watch a presentation about your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, right? These are things that have happened in many of these organizations for a long time. And so for constituents to be savvy enough, and I really appreciated, Galen's point about the political aspect of this, right? For attorney generals to understand that this is a galvanizing issue that can make sure that you stay in office, that can make sure that, you gain the political support that you need. Yeah. Some of this was also birthed out of a certain practice and behavior of religious organizations that they are now upset, though legally and rightfully so, but they are now upset that they are on the other side of those things, right? And so culturally, if we're thinking about, all right, how do we calm down some of these hostilities? It's not just about the legal questions that are here, but being transparent about why we are here, right? Because we have seen, and we talked about this on the show, many religious organizations who have inserted themselves into the healthcare space, which, by the way, is a market, right? By the way, it's a business, right? They've inserted themselves in these spaces and are irritated when people who need healthcare, which is already extremely difficult to get, extremely expensive to get, and usually meets people at the most stressful times in their lives, has now become, or rather now these religious organizations are saddled with expectations, right? And so you don't get to have it both ways. It may be legally convenient to be upset today. But I think religious organizations need to be mindful of how they maybe brought this upon themselves 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and what have you.
Melissa, it seems as though one thing religious organizations have loved is the idea of not having to disclose information. You don't see our membership. You don't see where our tithe is. You don't see where the money goes. And it seems that we're seeing a slow creep to try to get information and not allowing you to use the bar of religion. And that seems to be where we're kind of leaning nowadays.
Yeah, I certainly will stand with the religious organizations as far as their right to be able to keep information private, as far as particularly as it relates to clients or members, congregants that have entrusted this organization with very personal data, right? I think that there's a requirement on their part to honor that trust, and so. Absolutely, I completely agree with that. Religious organizations can always do much better in transparency as far as how much money comes in, how the money is being used. But I agree with Andrew's point that this is just complete overreach, and with sort of no justification from the Attorney General's office in this situation as far as the information that they're wanting. There's no explanation as to why it's needed or in any way.
Right. I'm going to have to let that be the last word, but I think we're right on point with this, trying to figure out how do you justify gathering information and then in the same breath causing people to be comfortable that it won't become public in some form or fashion. So as a result thereof, hopefully we can find a right balance that we can protect all parties as we go forward in these type of issues. Hey, Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Hey, Orlin, did you know that Oak Flat is the site of a 4-day ceremony that Apache girls participate in? It actually facilitates the spiritual transition from child to young woman.
Didn't know that. Nia Johnson, tell me something I don't know.
So did you know that when Kaiser Family Foundation surveyed 1,000 registered voters, that an increase in cost premiums may cause 50% of those voters to actually register to vote for the current election?
Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Orlin, if you've ever gone to a wedding and been asked to give a toast or to raise a toast at New Year's, did you know that that's actually literally from a Roman tradition of dropping a piece of toast in your wine, both as a sign of good health and a remembrance that when you're drinking a lot of wine, you should probably eat something too.
Galen, tell me something I don't know.
So in Africa, about 40% of the health care is provided by faith-based organizations and often some of the best care, but in many countries, only 2% or less of the national health budget is allocated to that 40% of the care.
Wow, unbelievable. Thanks so much for that information. I'm going to use that probably later this week. Thank you for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.